Morning. So, yeah, you just saw my technological competence at work. So right there. Wow, it's so good to be here with you. So if you don't know me, my name's David Nystrom. I'm married to Christina, 39 years. Man. And we have a daughter, Annika, who's 22. And I'm a professor at Western Seminary here in Northern California. And do you want to know, should I do a little bit more of this? Okay. Because it's totally interesting. So I did my PhD work in two areas. On the one hand, New Testament theology, so I publish in New Testament primarily, but also Roman social history. So two very different disciplines, but I was fascinated by not just New Testament theology, but how it interacts with real life. So I mostly publish in New Testament, but also publish in Roman history. Those are really awesome conventions to go to, by the way. And a little bit in first century Judaism and early Christianity. Boy, I don't sound very, as I hear myself say that, I think, this is going to be a tough half hour right in front of us. So I'm just so pleased to be here, and I think of myself as a cousin who gets to walk in without ringing the doorbell, and I can go to the refrigerator and help myself. That's how I feel about Hillside. So, and I think most of you feel like it's okay for me to do that. So that's good. So, we're just starting. I think this is week 3 of a series on Proverbs, right? So, can we have the first slide? So, it's called the Dream House series. So, and today's the 23rd. Wisdom for the whole of life, Proverbs 31. So, next slide. So, big picture. Proverbs 1:20, wisdom cries aloud in the street, in the market she raises her voice. So the idea here is, it's not that hard to find wisdom. Wisdom is yelling at you. You just got to figure out, what are you going to listen to? Right? Isn't that a struggle? Like, to what are we going to listen? To what are we going to pay attention? Because and we live in an era where that has been vastly multiplied. When John Adams left Braintree, Massachusetts, that's where he was living, to go to the Continental Convention, it took him 12 days to get there, riding a horse. And not, growing up watching, TV, I thought you always galloped on horses all the time, but apparently not. So anyway, and he went with this one guy, had 12 days to just sit and talk. And just think how non-overloaded was his inbox. So we need to do even more than most people throughout history to create space. So wisdom cries aloud in the street. It's not hard to find. It's yelling at you if you'll just pay attention and be wise about what you're paying attention. And then Proverbs 8, does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights beside the way, at the crossroads she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals she cries aloud. To you, O men, I call, and my cry is to the children of men. So in both Hebrew and Greek, the word wisdom is in the feminine case. In English, we don't really have cases, but that's why it's a she. So personified wisdom is a she. So both these, both Proverbs 1 and then Proverbs 8, make the case, wisdom is not hard to find. You just got to open your eyes. You just got to start paying attention. Next slide. Oh, yeah. Anything else you want to? I made this slide show, but you think I know what's in it. So any other observations you have just from those previous verses? So could you back up one slide? Any thoughts? Anything strike you?
Wisdom got to cry out. It's not a little whisper. It's got to cry out.
Yeah, it's not whispering. Not only is it not hard to find, it's yelling at you. Why did you do that? In case you haven't noticed, I'm totally cool with this being a participation event. So anything else people notice?
We're showing things other things shouting at us as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Not the only thing yelling.
Yeah, and we often are really, we have a hard time noticing what's important. We don't actually notice everything. Have I told you the story about my dad and my mom at the church business meeting? Have I told you that story? So one day, I was, 10. There was a church business meeting. My dad worked late, and he got there after my mom was already there. And it was sort of like this, people spread throughout the sanctuary, a Peninsula Covenant, that's where I grew up. And my dad walked in and saw my mom sitting by herself, and there were a group of people, their friends, arranged behind my mom, and Dad thought, here's an opportunity for drama. And he sat down next to my mom, threw his arm over her head, pulled her, put her on his shoulder, pulled her to him, gave her this elaborate, lengthy kiss, let her rest back in the chair, and instead of my mom being, swooning, she was really upset, glowering at him. What's the matter? And she said, look behind me. And there, on the lap of the terrified woman behind my mom, was my mom's wig. Because when my dad put his arm over her head, he knocked her wig off, flew through the air, landed on this lap, and my dad's looking at my mom and doesn't even notice. So that's what we're like sometimes, right? We're paying attention to the wrong thing. Next slide. Next slide, please. And then the next one. Then the next one. So here's our passage. An excellent wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, but he will have no lack of gain. She does him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hand, she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant. Her strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. Next slide. So what do you think? What do you see? It's a pretty well-known passage. Not everybody really likes that passage. So what strikes you?
She provides.
Pardon?
She provides.
She provides. Yep. She.
It's overwhelming to hear that if you're a woman.
Why? I'm not a woman, so why?
Because the standards that are set are really high.
Okay, high standards, yeah.
It's a good contrast because some of the chapters before, women are prostitutes and all of that. So it's nice to have something not said about women.
So what you just said is it's nice to have something nice said about women, and there was general agreement in the crowd.
From women.
From women. That also is true. Yeah, anything else strike you?
I'm glad they didn't write a chapter about guys.
Yeah. Well, they sort of did. I mean, he's just sitting there with his buddies in the gates, and she's the one, like, doing everything else. She is appreciated. Yep. Okay, next slide. So, an excellent wife who can find. She is far more precious than jewels. So it's a wife of character. So that's part of what the text is saying is, well, that makes, that's laudable. That's worth pursuing. And it's character, not just performance. Right? I mean, we have, I think in our culture we've lost some of that. It used to be, long before the student debt crisis, but people thought education was about not just learning stuff. What can I do with this stuff? A purely instrumental understanding of education. But education was thought of as having some kind of function in character formation. And we've pretty much, it's pretty much nobody thinks about that. Not even Christian schools think about that in my opinion, in any deeply thoughtful way. And that's largely because of the pressure of the economics. So character, not just performance. And character is rare. You know, most of us are mixed when it comes to this issue. Right? I mean, we can do things that are marvelously laudable, and then the next minute there's something happens, we do something that reveals there's a less than super awesome parts of us. Next slide. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. So, we know very little about such matters in the ancient world. We know very little about the relationships within the family. Now, what we can say, a little bit even from the scriptures, is that the patriarchs were not exactly like someone you'd really want for your uncle or your dad. There's some pretty nasty stuff. Some of them, there's stories of them visiting prostitutes, or they don't treat their widowed daughter-in-law well. And so she masquerades, she has sexual relations with her father-in-law just to, in effect, to create a machinery for him to take up his proper responsibilities. Very few women enjoyed anything like, that we can tell, anything like a modern sense of a healthy interpersonal relationship. Now, we do have a few letters from the Roman period of husbands of the business class, of the really pretty high upper class, on a business ship writing back to their wife. But we know very little, generally, about women and their and family relationships in the ancient world. What we do know, for instance, is that like the household codes in the New Testament, where Paul writes husbands, wives, children, slaves. We have household codes from that same period in the secular world, but in those, the person writing the advice is writing it only to the husband or the man of the house. Here's how you should treat your wife. Here's how you should treat your children. Here's how you should treat your slaves. What's remarkable about the New Testament letters is Paul actually addresses slaves. Just imagine that. That's deeply subversive of the standards of the day. Next slide. She does him good, not harm, all the days of her life. Well, Monica, maybe the one woman from the ancient world we know quite a lot about, the mother of Augustine. She spent her life placating her ill-tempered husband. That's pretty clear. 13, she takes wool and flax and works with willing hands. She's a decision maker. So this passage portrays a woman as a decision maker, as an independent agent. And it's unlikely that anyone hearing this in the original context would say, oh yeah, I've seen that lots of times. So she's her own boss, and she's personally involved. Next slide. She's like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. So she's diligent, she's watchful, she works hard, she keeps a tight schedule. She's probably got 3 pages of to-do lists and lists of her to-do. I have lists of my to-do list right now. She's probably got some of those. She's responsible, she's thoughtful. Next slide. Yeah, she considers a field and buys it. She has her own earnings and she makes her own decisions. So this is a passage which in its context is deeply subversive of the then typical social pattern. So in a world in which women had generally very few prerogatives. Next slide. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable, her lamp doesn't go out. She puts her hands at a distaff and her hands, is that how you spell that word, distaff? That's not a word, I don't think I've ever heard that word in Starbucks. So in the spindle. So she's diligent, and this is this is a typical Proverbs trope. Wise, foolish, lazy, diligent. So those two, those pairs of opposites. Next slide. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. So she's a person of compassion. She understands the vagaries of life. Right? So much of the way our lives work has nothing to do with our own diligence or education. A lot of it is just where we grew up. Imagine how different your life would be if you were born in Syria 25 years ago. So a lot of us just had the benefit of growing up in the United States. So she understands the vagaries of life and has compassion on others. Next slide. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. So she plans, and she has wisdom, chachma. That's the Hebrew, which means it can mean smarts, but it's also street smarts. Knowing how to negotiate. And she's a person of character. Next slide. So, now once again, any observations?
Is this the only passage in Proverbs where a woman is identified and explained as opposed to being used as a metaphor for either following, you're either going to go for the hooker or you're going to have the nice dinner party with the nice lady?
There are other passages, but this is the only one that's a sustained reflection where a woman is cast in this sort of position, this sort of role. And there are spread throughout Scripture. There are texts that indicate that the general pattern, there's something whacked out about it. Think about David's ancestors. Ruth. Who comes with Naomi from the far country, and even Rahab. So there is an awareness that like women who are prostitutes in the Old Testament, it wasn't like they said, "Yeah, should I go to UC Berkeley or be a prostitute?" I don't know. They were often they had the conditions of their life shaped not just but certainly the general direction of the decisions available to them. So this is a challenging text. It's not one that easily fits our postmodern sensibilities, right? This is one of those texts that we say, boy, it's hard to talk about this one, with people outside a churchy context. So I'm going to suggest we put on our thinking caps for the next few minutes. Next slide. So the Bible, of course, is authoritative. I believe that. I think you believe that. I don't get to say, no, I don't really like that. I like these parts, but not those parts. And the patriarchs were, some of them, the Bible contains stories of real human beings. And the patriarchs were untrustworthy at times and philandering at times. Hardly exemplars. Next slide. Solomon, the wise Solomon, he sponsored the worship of other gods, right? I mean, so his wisdom, his wisdom gas tank ran out pretty quick. So how are we to understand that? Next slide. So for the patriarchs, for the Hebrews, God is king. But once in the land, right, they demand a human king. And that's their passage there, just of beautiful emotion as God says, okay, I'm going to give you a king. But but let's not forget that that's the result of your rejecting me. And you know what? Your kings aren't going to be very trustworthy. That's going to turn in your hand. So, I mean, we as human beings are just never satisfied. We get something and we're in love with it, and then a week later we're looking at something new. Like, we have really short attention spans. And in a heartbreaking passage in 1 Samuel 8, God relents, but also warns them what's going to come to pass. So next slide. So the kings would be untrustworthy representatives of the reign of God. Only 3 or 4 have anything good said about them. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the score is, just way over triple, double digits of just horrible things that the kings did and where they led the people. Next slide. But the king was a symbol of God's presence. Next slide. So how can we understand this? The kings, most of them were reprehensible as agents of God's will and purpose. God who rules by the word of revelation. And so the wisdom tradition is created. We're ancient Hebrews. We're maybe 100 years into the kingship. And wow, the king is the agent of God's power. And he's a reprehensible human being. And so the wisdom tradition is created to provide an alternate source for how to follow God. It's a little like the bridge is out, but there's this detour around the problem. Next slide. So the wisdom tradition, wisdom, chachama, cries aloud in the streets. It's skill, it's understanding. So it's not book smart alone, but it's insightful and thoughtful. And you get this also in the New Testament, Philippians 1, 9 through 10. It's my prayer that your love may abound more and more in all knowledge and all discernment. So not just your love, just gooey, not very thoughtful love, but that your love would abound more and more in knowledge, that's the smart stuff, and discernment, that's like knowing when what's appropriate. And then Paul says that you may, and it's a lot of English translations make this kind of hard to understand. It's a present active participle, diapheronta, that you may do the things that really matter. Think about that. What really matters? And as we derive at what really matters, Paul says, so I want you to be knowledgeable, but also discerning. So that you may think about, okay, we're in this situation right now. What is needful? What really needs to happen? And how can I arrive at that? Have a knowledge base, but also a discernment activity going on. Next slide. So that's this whole package of wisdom. So not book smart, but insightful and thoughtful and practical combined with knowledge. And so we get in Job, that's part of the wisdom tradition. The aged, with the aged is wisdom. Not always. There were some whacked out old people. But I mean, but you learn stuff. At least you've had the opportunity to learn stuff. I've had experiences where I say, okay, that bit me, and you know what? I should have learned that 10 years ago when this bit me the first time. And Solomon, I said, prays for wisdom. Not just smarts, but this combination. Smarts, practical knowledge, how to move forward. Next slide. And there are 4 books, Wisdom, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, that make this case. Next slide. So the wisdom psalms, like Psalm 119, right? I don't know if you've noticed this. 22 sections of 8 verses each. because there's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Because in written Hebrew, there are no vowels. It's just consonants. So, and the first 8 verses all start with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph, and then Beit, and then Gimel. So that's a giant acrostic puzzle, saying, look, there's a way to live life where it makes sense. There's a rational template. So Proverbs, great advice. The locusts have no king, but they march in rank. We cut other people off in traffic, and maybe with accompanying hand signals. So we're not very smart as a group. Locusts have no king, but they know what's the most orderly way for everybody to make it through. Imagine that. So that's great advice. Worldly, just here at the level of practicality. Next slide. But Proverbs knows there's more. Proverbs 26. Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you'll be like him yourself. Answer a fool according to his folly, or he'll be wise in his own eyes. So here's 2 verses right next to each other. And they say the opposite thing. Because Proverbs is saying, you know what, there are situations in life that are more complex than just this practical everyday wisdom. Next slide. There's also Ecclesiastes. Solomon, the wisest person who ever lived. And what does he say? I want to figure out what makes life satisfying. What makes life satisfying? I know, I'll build stuff. And he talks about all the stuff he's built, and he says, yeah, it didn't really do the thing for me. And then he says, I'll try sexuality. 300 wives, 700 concubines. Do the math. I mean, really? Really? And then he says, that didn't satisfy. And then wisdom. Yeah, I learned all kinds of stuff and all these wisdom sayings, but you know what? I got tired. And so what Solomon is saying here, see, there's no relief under the sun, right? That's that theme over and over, under the sun. And implicit in there is, wow, true wisdom beyond the human level is only perceived by looking above the sun. So it's not to say that the wisdom of this world is wrong. It's valuable, but it's not the whole picture. Next slide. And then Job. Job is the perfect Proverbs guy. And he's been rewarded. He's wacky rich. He's got way more stuff than anybody ever. And he's the perfect Proverbs guy. He does everything right. And so he's been blessed. And then it's all taken away. And his friends come and say, dude, you had to do something wrong. Everybody knows it's a simple cause and effect relationship. If you do the right thing, God will reward you. And Job says after a while, I know I didn't do anything wrong, and yet I've been whacked. And how does it end? God says to Job, who are you? Where were you when I created the universe? Part of being human then is to recognize we can never fully understand God. And so it relies on trust. Though he slay me, yet will I fear him. Because God knows more than we do. Next slide. So that's the big picture of the wisdom tradition. The wisdom tradition isn't trying to say it's everything, but it is trying to say it's good, practical direction for this life. But this passage is rather corrosive of the norms of the day. It presents a woman as an archetype. Next slide. It's a word for eternity and a word for their own time. And here the particulars reveal, I think, deeper principles. It's about practical wisdom, smarts for the day-to-day. Next slide. Yeah, so ectypal knowledge is knowledge as we understand it. Archetypal is knowledge as God understands it. Next slide. So what can you observe about this woman? Next slide. First, she's the exemplar of noble character. And a noble or faithful character is rare. It's thoughtful. Most of us do something thoughtful and the next minute something foolish. But hers is a life of reflective, wise discipline. She says, okay, this is what I think, but I'm gonna let it run through the logic loop one more time. I'm gonna recognize that I thought I was right before and it turned out I was wrong, so I'm gonna have a little godly agnosticism. Next slide. Second, such a pattern of wisdom is valuable to others. I don't know if you think about that. I mean, maybe, in our day where the focus seems to be just on your own self, but this notion that we are, whether we know it or not, like it or not, we are part of an organism. So it's valuable to others. Her husband values it. It's registered in precious items, and she's called a treasure. And in the long run, it delivers worth and safety for everyone. And she seeks what's important, not for that which is fleeting. Next slide. And she's diligent. She works into the night. She engages in business. She's not lazy. Next slide. So what can we conclude? Next slide. First, she lives a life of principle. So should we. Be thoughtful about character. Work on character, not stuff. And that's very difficult because our world is so pushed in the last, even more and more all the time in the last 20, 30 years towards stuff, towards purely instrumental purposes. Next slide. And she's a great example of that. Second, value people. That comes through so strongly here. The good wife breaks the stereotype. She cares for her family. She cares for her servants. She's up before her servants, doing stuff for the people who work for her. And she opens her arms to the poor. She extends her hands to the needy. Generosity, really the most important thing about generosity is what it does to you. It helps you learn that you're not the center of the universe. Next slide. And there's something here about moral reasoning. In the story of the Good Samaritan, right, that Jesus tells, the priest and the Levite do the right thing. They're supposed to avoid becoming unclean, and the guy is left for dead. So they don't know if he's alive or dead. And if you touch a dead body, you're unclean for a week. It's a priest and a Levite. So their law says, don't take a chance. And Jesus tells that story because it illustrates moral reasoning. And he's in effect saying, actions relate to rules. Right? There are certain rules. Don't run a red light. And you do an action that runs a red light. But it's not just because everybody knows red lights have to be obeyed, so actions relate to rules, but rules are not the end of the story. Rules are there to encapsulate or to protect or to enforce principles. And the basic principle is safety. Well, what if you were in paradise during the fire 3 years ago? And you were trying to get out of town, but the light turned red. It would be the wrong thing to stop at that light. Because the idea of the whole traffic light is to promote safety. So what's the basic principle? And then what's the ground underneath it? So Jesus says, right? What's the central features of the law? Jesus says to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus' teaching, it builds on this complex. It's in the Old Testament. Part of the wisdom, that's part of the whole wisdom tradition, is that these are like rules, and they're good. But let's also remember the principles that those rules reflect. Next slide. So what else can we include? Trust in God and God alone. 31:30, the very end of the whole book, the writer says she fears the Lord. So her own ethic of get up early, Poor Richard's Almanac, early to bed, early to rise, that she knows isn't the whole of it. That's good advice for day to day, but there is a deeper wisdom that is a part of the larger ecology. So she fears the Lord. She has proper respect and awareness. Next slide. So what can we conclude? Well, we got to expect the world to be tricksy. We got to expect the world to be such that we can't really trust it completely. And if you didn't believe that, then the last 2 years have given us all plenty of experience of saying, what? We don't really understand it as well as we thought we did. And some who are evil or selfish or cannot escape the gravitational pull of their own selves, they're going to be rewarded. But in spite of that, we should live a life of principle. Because this world is not all there is. We ought to live in it like the good wife, thoughtful, moral, but recognize this world is not all there is. And live a life of dependence upon God. Next slide. Boethius was a scholar who lived in the Ostrogoth kingdom of Theodoric in the early 500s AD. So this is right, the king right before the king who was reigning when Boethius was alive was the first Germanic king to say, I'm not even going to try to pretend we're the Roman Empire anymore. And the paranoid king asked Boethius to assume an important role in government, and then about 530 he abruptly imprisoned him and had him executed a few months later. So in prison he was first totally bummed out, but then he started thinking about his fate, and he composed one of the great books in human history called The Consolation of Philosophy. Next slide. Chaucer translated it into English, and Dante used its structure. He just borrowed the structure for his Divine Comedy. And in his book, he says, here I am in prison, and I'm visited by Lady Philosophy, philosophy personified. And she tells me, you know what? There's very little about human life that humans can control. Lady Fortune, some other lady, spins her wheel. The wheel of fortune. And she gives her gifts, wealth, career, and she can arbitrarily take them away. So next slide. So that's the wheel of fortune. So I want to put all of this down in closing in this broader context, is that we live in a broken world. And evil's going to happen to good people. So how do we live through that? Well, on the one hand, there is good practical wisdom for the everyday, and Proverbs is all about that. Here are things you ought to focus on. Diligence, kindness, having an awareness of our connectedness to other people, etc. But always recognize that in this broken world, justice doesn't necessarily happen. And so there's another wisdom, a deeper wisdom, that is the God who made you and loves you and me holds the future in his hands. So while there is importance to the practical nature of wisdom in Proverbs itself knows there is this deeper truth that history is in God's hands. And we can rely on him as we trust in him. Thank you, Father, for your love for us and for, well, the fact you don't just vaporize us right away, which we deserve. Thank you. Thank you for the brilliant, poignant thoughtfulness of the biblical authors, and in particular, this book of Proverbs, which offers such comforting, helpful, wise insight. May our hearts be willing to absorb it and our minds to reflect upon it. We pray these things in your name. And all God's people said,